What if I told you that some of the witches in medieval Europe didn't just fly on broomsticks, they tripped on them? That the stories of witches soaring through the night sky weren't just fantasy, but strange echoes of very real, very mind-altering experiences fueled by medieval chemistry? Let's go back in time. No, not to the castles and knights you've seen in movies, but to the dark corners of crumbling cottages, to the overgrown herb gardens behind convent walls, and the old women stirring thick, bubbling brews over low fires. These weren't Disney witches. They were herbalists, midwives, healers, and sometimes something far more mysterious. In the Middle Ages, knowledge of plants was passed down in whispers. Women, especially the older, unmarried ones, were often the keepers of this knowledge. They knew which leaves could heal a fever, which roots could end a pregnancy, and which seeds could take your mind somewhere else. Among the most infamous of these recipes, the legendary flying ointment. Now, the term flying ointment might sound like fantasy, but it appears again and again in witch trial records, in confessions extracted under duress, and even in the curious notes of medieval physicians. These ointments were often made using plants like belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and datura, all members of the nightshade family. They weren't just dangerous, they were downright psychedelic. These plants contain potent tropane alkaloids, substances that, even in tiny doses, can cause intense hallucinations, delirium, a sense of leaving one's body, and even full-blown visions. Imagine thinking you were flying, talking to spirits, or entering another realm. To the medieval mind, that wasn't a trip, that was witchcraft. But here's where it gets weirder. The so-called witches didn't just swallow these herbs. That would be far too dangerous. The doses were unpredictable, the side effects sometimes lethal. So, instead, the ointments were applied transdermally, rubbed onto the skin, specifically onto areas with thin membranes, underarms, genitals, even broom handles. Yes, you heard that right. Several historians have speculated that the infamous image of a witch flying on a broomstick may have originated from this practice. A long wooden stick coated in psychoactive salve applied in private, and then the visions begin. One 15th century record even described women saying they were transported to distant places, feasting and dancing with the devil himself, all without leaving their rooms. To them, it felt real as life. And who are we to say it wasn't? Of course, in medieval Europe, this was more than just dangerous experimentation, it was heresy. The Church believed such experiences were invitations to demons. The Inquisition classified the flying ointment not as folk medicine, but as evidence of a pact with Satan. In reality, it was likely the result of centuries of plant-based pharmacology that blurred the line between healing, dreaming, and, well, getting high. It wasn't only women who dabbled. Some monks, especially those involved in preserving ancient medical texts, had access to these plants too. But while monks cloaked their experiments in the language of medicine or spiritual enlightenment, women were more likely to be accused of sorcery. Isn't that interesting? Two people used the same plant. One is called a doctor, the other a witch. The difference wasn't science, it was power. Now, not every mention of flight or transformation was a literal drug trip. Medieval Europe was a deeply symbolic world. Dreams, visions, and altered states of consciousness were often understood as messages from God or temptations from Satan. But when someone confessed under torture to riding through the sky with demons or mixing a brew that made them see the other world, there's a good chance they weren't lying. They were remembering the dizzying, terrifying, liberating experience of plant-based euphoria. Flying ointments weren't the only way medieval people altered their minds, but they were among the most feared. Not because of what they did, but because of what they represented. A world outside the Church's control. A way of seeing, feeling, and knowing that bypassed priests and confessions. And that made them dangerous. Even today, modern chemists have analyzed some preserved recipes for flying ointments and confirmed the presence of scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyanin, substances that can cause vivid, dreamlike hallucinations. Small wonder that people truly believed they had flown, changed shape, or spoken to otherworldly beings. It's easy to laugh at those old stories of broomsticks and witches dancing with the devil under a full moon, but dig a little deeper and you find a truth that's more fascinating and perhaps more unsettling. These weren't just fairy tales, they were echoes of real, deeply altered states of consciousness achieved through careful or careless use of natural chemistry. So the next time you hear someone dismiss medieval folk magic as superstition, remember this. Those silly old witches were conducting chemical experiments centuries before the word psychedelic even existed. They didn't have labs, they had gardens. They didn't wear lab coats, they wore aprons, but make no mistake, they were unlocking doors in the human mind that most people were too afraid to open. And maybe, just maybe, they really did fly. If this story changed the way you think about history, drop a like, subscribe for more weird truths from the past, and tell us in the comments, would you ever try a flying ointment if you could? Or is this one medieval mystery best left in the shadows of time? In medieval Europe, not every high came from a mysterious witch's brew. Some were administered by physicians, some were self-prescribed by desperate souls in pain, and others, they slipped quietly into daily life. In teas, tinctures, incense, and poultices, as both healing agents and spiritual gateways. Let's talk about cannabis and opium, two ancient substances with thousands of years of history behind them, and yet in the Middle Ages they occupied a strange gray area, hovering between medicine, magic, and mystery. Start with cannabis. It wasn't a stranger to Europe. Hemp was widely cultivated for rope, cloth, and even food, but the plant's resinous flowers, the part that produces psychoactive effects, were less commonly used, at least in written European sources, and yet some evidence suggests it wasn't unknown. In medieval medical texts, cannabis was listed as a treatment for various ailments: gout, tumors, coughs, and fevers. The famous 11th century physician Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became a cornerstone in European and Islamic medical schools, mentions it as a treatment for headaches and to calm the humors. The idea of using it to soothe the body and mind was there, it just wasn't talked about loudly. Why? Because intoxication was a theological issue as much as a medical one. The Christian Church discouraged anything that altered consciousness. Wine was allowed, even sacred, but getting drunk was frowned upon. Anything that caused visions or pleasure without a clear religious context was suspect, and cannabis, when used in high enough doses, could do both. But here's where things get interesting. In folk practices, especially among midwives, herbalists, and mystics, cannabis may have played a quiet but consistent role. Mixed into oils, smoked as incense, or steeped in strong teas, it was used to treat pain, anxiety, and even induce trances. But it wasn't called getting high. It was called healing, or cleansing, or preparing the mind for spiritual work. Much like flying ointments, cannabis straddled a fine line. In the hands of the right person, it was medicine. In the hands of the wrong one, it became witchcraft. And then there's opium. Unlike cannabis, opium had a well-documented and respected place in medieval medicine. Derived from the poppy plant, it was a prized import from the East, Persia, Egypt, and later the Ottoman Empire. In its raw form, it was known as opium thebaicum, and it was used widely for pain relief, sleep induction, and cough suppression. Physicians, the ones trained in monastic schools and connected to wealthy patrons, used it regularly. A tincture called theriac was a blend of dozens of ingredients, including opium, cinnamon, myrrh, and sometimes even snake flesh, and was believed to be a universal antidote. Rich people paid fortunes for it, poorer folks made do with poppy tea or opium-laced wine. And make no mistake, this wasn't a gentle sleep aid. Opium could knock you out, it could numb the pain of surgery, yes, even in the days before anesthesia. It could soothe the dying, it could ease the torment of diseases like plague, syphilis, and tuberculosis, but it also caused hallucinations, confusion, euphoria, and addiction. And medieval people noticed. There are accounts of monks and scholars lost in ecstasy, of patients drifting into death with smiles on their faces. Some saw these reactions as proof of the drug's divine power, a glimpse of heaven. Others saw it as a dangerous trick, a way for demons to sneak in. In some regions, especially those closer to Islamic influence, the use of opium and cannabis was more normalized. Islamic scholars wrote about them in detail, not just as medicines, but as tools for spiritual enlightenment. The Sufis, for example, were known to use substances that enhanced trance states. Their philosophy was different from the Christian West. It accepted that altered states could bring one closer to the divine, not just away from it. But in Europe, things remained uneasy. A nobleman could use opium and call it healing. A peasant woman using the same thing might be accused of poisoning or witchcraft. A monk experimenting with cannabis might say he was seeking divine vision. A lay person doing the same might be condemned as a heretic. The drugs themselves didn't change, the story around them did. That's the real twist. Because when you strip away the robes, the rituals, the incense and candles, you see something familiar. People, whether in the 1300s or now, were trying to escape pain, to quiet the noise, to feel pleasure, to understand something deeper. And sometimes the path to that understanding ran through a leaf, a petal, or a few drops of dark resin. You might be wondering, if cannabis and opium were so common, why don't we hear more about them in medieval pop culture? The answer is stigma and censorship. Later generations of religious reformers and moral crusaders rewrote the past. They downplayed how common these substances were or recast their use as demonic. The idea that monks could have been high or that nuns might have brewed poppy tea didn't fit the tidy narrative of piety and suffering. But the records are there if you know where to look. In dusty medical manuscripts, in the marginalia of monastic journals, in the whispered stories passed down in rural communities, stories of wise women with red-stained fingers from picking poppies, of travelers carrying strange powders in carved wooden boxes, of dreams that felt more real than waking life. And here's the strange beauty of it all: for every person who feared these substances, there was another who used them with reverence, carefully, respectfully, as a way not to escape the world, but to understand it. In today's world, we're circling back. Cannabis is legal in many places. Opium derivatives are still in every hospital. We've built entire industries around what was once called witchcraft or heresy. But maybe, just maybe, those medieval healers and mystics were onto something. Maybe the line between medicine and magic was never real. If this story gave you a new perspective on the so-called Dark Ages, hit the like button, subscribe for more strange truths from history, and let us know in the comments, do you think the past was more psychedelic than we give it credit for? In the medieval world, alcohol wasn't just a drink, it was a necessity. Water was often contaminated, especially in growing towns where waste disposal was rudimentary at best. So instead of taking their chances with possibly deadly water, people of all classes turned to ale, mead, and wine as daily staples. But alcohol wasn't merely functional, it was social, spiritual, and at times deeply intoxicating. The average medieval peasant consumed more alcohol in a day than most modern people would in a weekend, but we need to understand not all alcohol was created equal. Small ale commonly brewed at home had a low alcohol content, about 2% or less, and was safe enough for children. Yes, children drank it. They had to. In fact, in many villages, it was the only reliable source of hydration. But that didn't mean medieval folks were lightweights. When the occasion called for it, religious festivals, harvest feasts, weddings, or even executions, the alcohol got stronger. Monks, who were among the most skilled brewers, perfected recipes for high-alcohol ales, meads infused with herbs, and wine strong enough to burn the throat. They called it craftsmanship. Some may have called it divine inspiration. Now here's the twist. While today we associate heavy drinking with recklessness, in the Middle Ages it was often seen as a communal good. Drinking together bonded people. It relaxed tensions. It gave peasants relief from the endless toil of daily life. For one night, after weeks of brutal labor in the fields, a villager could sip something warm, feel the weight lift, and laugh freely. That moment, brief as it was, meant everything. In the taverns and alehouses, the line between reality and escape blurred. You could overhear scandalous gossip, hear a minstrel sing of faraway lands, or find yourself dancing beside the very landlord you feared stone sober. Alcohol leveled the playing field, if only for a few hours. But not everyone approved. The church maintained a love-hate relationship with alcohol. Wine was essential in the Eucharist, the blood of Christ, and monasteries were, ironically, some of the largest producers of beer and wine in Europe. But drunkenness, that was sin, gluttony, a surrender to the flesh. So while monks and priests brewed and poured, they also preached moderation from the pulpit. That contradiction seeped into society. Nobles drank in great halls with goblets of French wine imported at great cost. Peasants drank from wooden mugs filled with murky ale. Both groups got drunk. But the stories we hear about drunkenness, wild peasants, sinful women, dangerous revelers, often came from the pens of clerics who saw disorder as a threat. And yet, the evidence of alcohol's popularity is everywhere. In medieval England, there were more alehouses than churches. In towns like Norwich or York, some streets had dozens of small taverns, usually run by women, where local brews were sold by the mug. These weren't fancy joints, just a room, a fire, a barrel of ale, and maybe a bit of bread. But for the weary traveler or overworked farmer, they were sanctuaries. In Germany, beer became a craft of pride, with certain towns gaining reputations for their secret recipes. In Scandinavia, mead from fermented honey was the drink of warriors and bards. In France and Italy, wine was more than a beverage. It was a symbol of class, of sophistication, of culture. But wherever you went, alcohol was a cultural glue, and sometimes it was much more. For those who couldn't afford a physician, and that was most people, alcohol became medicine. Wine was used to clean wounds, mixed into herbal remedies, and given to women in labor to dull the pain. Brandy was rubbed on sore joints, spiced ale helped fight off winter chills, and in moments of despair, a strong drink was the only comfort left. There are stories of dying men asking for their last mug of beer, of soldiers marching into battle with flasks of fiery schnapps, of widows toasting the dead with the same wine they served on their wedding day. Alcohol was part of life, part of death, part of the in-between. And while the word alcoholic didn't exist, addiction certainly did. Monks wrote of men who could not rise in the morning without a draught, or women who sought the tavern before their prayers. In some towns, repeat offenders were branded or fined for public drunkenness, but the idea of treating addiction didn't exist. It was seen as moral failure, a weakness of the soul, not an illness of the body or mind. Still, people drank. They drank after childbirth, after funerals, after plagues. They drank to celebrate harvests, to mourn losses, to endure the long, cold winters. And in those moments, alcohol didn't just offer a buzz, it offered a kind of spiritual anesthesia. A softening of the harsh medieval world, a momentary escape from poverty, violence, or fear. For some, alcohol opened the door to visions. Not hallucinations like with opium or flying ointments, but dream-like states brought on by extreme inebriation. A few medieval mystics even claimed to have received divine messages during drunken trances. Most were dismissed, some were executed, but the stories lingered. The 14th century account tells of a woman in France who drank heavily during Lent, a scandalous act. When questioned, she claimed the wine helped her speak to the angels. The court found her guilty of blasphemy, but local legend turned her into a kind of folk hero, the drunkard saint, misunderstood by men, favored by spirits. That's the thing with medieval alcohol. It existed at the crossroads of necessity and transcendence, a liquid paradox, at once a danger and a salvation. Today we might romanticize the idea of a medieval tavern, candlelit, filled with laughter and song, but for many it was more than ambiance. It was survival, a place to forget, a place to feel joy, a place to be human. If this journey through the ale-soaked streets of medieval Europe fascinated you, make sure to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, sacred, and scandalous corners of history, and tell us in the comments, would you drink in a medieval tavern if given the chance? Imagine a world where the very people who preached abstinence and self-control were also the masterminds behind some of the strongest and most sophisticated intoxicants of the Middle Ages. It sounds ironic, like discovering your local health guru also runs a whiskey distillery in his basement. But in medieval Europe, that contradiction was very real. Monks, those solemn, scripture-citing men in robes, were the original brewmasters, and their abbeys weren't just spiritual havens, they were laboratories of fermentation, experimentation, and, yes, intoxication. At first glance, it might seem strange. After all, monks took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Many lived secluded lives, dedicated to prayer, silence, and hard labor. But if you step inside the stone walls of a Benedictine monastery or a Cistercian cloister, especially during the 10th to 13th centuries, you'd likely find rows of bubbling barrels, gardens full of herbs, and a community deeply invested in the production of beer, wine, and herbal liquors. Why? The answer lies partly in necessity. Monasteries were often self-sufficient communities. They needed their own food, water, and, yes, safe drinks. Since clean water was unreliable, monks turned to brewing beer and fermenting wine to hydrate safely. But they didn't stop at just functional brewing. They perfected the craft. Monks became experts in timing fermentation, balancing flavors, and even selecting the best barley or grapes for their local climate. They kept meticulous records, noting down every ratio and step. Over time, these records became some of the earliest recipes in European brewing history. And as they shared their techniques with neighboring communities, the reputation of monastic alcohol spread far beyond the cloister walls. Many of the beer styles we still enjoy today, like Trappist ales, have their roots in those early monastic practices. Strong, rich, and aged to perfection, these beers weren't just drinks. They were symbols of the monastery's skill, generosity, and connection to the divine. In fact, brewing was considered a form of devotion, a way to glorify God through careful labor. The same went for wine. Monks in regions like Burgundy, Champagne, and the Rhine Valley were some of the first to recognize how soil, climate, and grape variety affected flavor. Long before terroir became a trendy word in the wine world, monks were already identifying which slopes produced the best vintages. They believed wine was not only a beverage but a sacred substance, used in mass, shared in hospitality, and preserved for generations. But there's another layer to this story. Monks weren't just brewing beer and wine, they were also creating herbal elixirs, potent mixtures of alcohol and medicinal plants. In many ways, these concoctions were the first liquors or spirits in Europe. One famous example is chartreuse, an intensely herbal liqueur made by Carthusian monks from a secret recipe of over 130 plants. Originally created as a medicine, it gained a cult following for its complex flavor and strong kick. These herbal spirits were usually brewed in monastic apothecaries, part chemistry lab, part hospital, part library. Monks used alcohol to extract the medicinal properties of herbs like wormwood, fennel, sage, or hyssop. Some of these mixtures were meant to soothe digestive issues, calm nerves, or fight infections. Others had more mysterious purposes. Certain brews were said to induce visions, enhance dreams, or open the mind to divine inspiration. It's no exaggeration to say that monks were the first true pharmacologists of the Middle Ages. They documented the effects of these substances with the same care they gave to their prayer schedules. And while they didn't think of their brews as getting high in the modern sense, they were fully aware of their mind-altering properties. Of course, not all church authorities were comfortable with this. There were tensions. Some bishops worried that monks were straying too far from their spiritual duties. Others feared the growing power of wealthy monasteries that profited from alcohol sales. And then there were the occasional scandals, rumors of intoxicated monks, secret feasts, or unauthorized experiments with plants known for their psychoactive effects. Yet despite the occasional outcry, the work continued. Monasteries became hubs of innovation, pushing the boundaries of what could be fermented, distilled, and preserved. And because of their literacy and record-keeping, their knowledge survived when much of the world's science was being lost or suppressed. There's a certain poetry in the idea that in a dark stone abbey lit by candlelight, a monk might be kneeling in prayer 1 hour and stirring a bubbling cauldron of spiced wine the next. That faith and fermentation could live side by side. That silence, discipline, and intoxicants weren't opposites, but part of the same search for meaning, balance, and survival. You might wonder, did the monks ever get drunk? They certainly tasted their brews, and while they were expected to practice moderation, the line between tasting and indulging could be thin. There are accounts of monasteries where monks consumed several pints of beer a day, justified by the idea that it was food, not pleasure. In colder climates, beer and ale were even considered essential for warmth and nutrition. In some abbeys, records show rationing systems. Each monk would receive a daily allotment, sometimes as much as a gallon of ale. But keep in mind, this wasn't your modern IPA. It was usually weak in alcohol, rich in calories, and consumed throughout the day. Still, when the stronger batches came out during Easter, Christmas, or the feast of a patron saint, restraint may have taken a backseat to celebration. Even today, monastic brewing continues. In Belgium, Trappist monasteries still produce world-famous beers under strict guidelines. The profits go to charity and the upkeep of the abbey. Visitors from around the world make pilgrimages not only to pray but to sample the sacred brew. It's a legacy of balance, earthly pleasure within spiritual purpose. So the next time you sip a complex ale, a deep red wine, or a strong herbal liqueur, think of the hands that first crafted it. Not scientists in lab coats, but monks in robes. Not in steel factories, but in stone cellars. Their lives were quiet, their devotion strict, but their creations, strong, sacred, and sometimes strange, changed the way the world drinks. Would you have trusted your local monk as both your spiritual guide and your neighborhood brewer? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this journey through the intoxicating corners of history, like this video, subscribe for more and stay tuned, because we've got one more wild tale to tell. Picture a flickering fire in a dark forest clearing. The air smells of burning herbs and damp earth. Shadows dance on the twisted trees, and the rhythmic chant of voices grows louder. You can't quite make out the words, but you know something is happening, something forbidden. Now imagine that you are in medieval Europe, and this isn't just a ceremony. It's a crime. To the authorities, it's witchcraft. To the church, it's heresy. But to those gathered around that fire, it might just be a way to escape reality, touch another realm, or even speak to spirits. This was the dangerous line people walked when they sought to get high in the Middle Ages. While alcohol and herbal brews were often accepted or even blessed by religious and medical authorities, the use of hallucinogens was another matter entirely. These weren't substances to relax with or share in celebration. They were portals to visions, nightmares, and altered states of mind. And because they were misunderstood, feared, and often associated with rebellion or heresy, they sparked some of the darkest moral panics in history. Some of the most powerful medieval highs came not from brewed drinks, but from plants. Plants like belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, or henbane, datura, and mandrake, each with psychoactive properties, each known to cause hallucinations, trances, and even out-of-body experiences. In small doses, these herbs might calm nerves or relieve pain, but in larger amounts they could induce terrifying visions or feelings of flight. And that's exactly where things got interesting. There are accounts, many whispered or accused rather than documented, of so-called witches using flying ointments, salves made from psychoactive herbs and animal fats, which they rubbed on their skin or broomsticks. According to folklore, this gave them the sensation of flying. Scholars today believe these mixtures likely caused a dissociative state, a mental detachment from the body, paired with vivid hallucinations. The result? The person believed they were flying to a Sabbath, a nighttime gathering of witches where they communed with spirits or danced with the devil. To the medieval church, this wasn't just dangerous, it was evil. The idea that women, and sometimes men, could gain power, experience visions, or alter reality without the church's blessing was deeply threatening. These experiences were seen not as personal or spiritual exploration, but as pacts with the devil. And so the Inquisitions began, trials, confessions, torture, all to root out what was seen as an unholy, drug-fueled rebellion against Christian order. But it wasn't just witches. Some of these substances appeared in religious mysticism too. Certain saints and visionaries reported ecstatic states, divine revelations, or prophetic dreams, often after periods of fasting, sleep deprivation, or consumption of mysterious herbs. It's impossible to know whether all of these were drug-induced, but the line between mysticism and madness, between divine ecstasy and chemical high, was thin and often walked unknowingly. In peasant communities, hallucinogenic plants weren't always seen as evil. They were sometimes used in folk medicine, love potions, or protective rituals. A mother might sprinkle belladonna in a doorway to ward off disease. A healer might brew henbane tea to ease the pain of childbirth. And yes, some sought visions, especially around solstices, eclipses, or pagan festivals that had survived beneath the surface of Christianity. These practices were often secret, handed down through oral tradition and protected by local custom. But when outsiders, especially church officials, found out, the consequences could be brutal. The use of psychoactive fungi is another murky chapter. Ergot, a mold that grows on rye, contains alkaloids that can cause intense hallucinations and convulsions. When accidentally consumed, it led to outbreaks of dancing mania, where entire towns would fall into fits of shaking, laughing, crying, and collapse. At the time, this was blamed on sin, spirits, or mass hysteria. But modern science points to ergot poisoning. Ironically, ergot is the source of LSD, one of the most powerful hallucinogens known today. And then there were the secret societies, the fringe religious groups, and the heretical sects who used altered states intentionally. The Brethren of the Free Spirit, for example, believed in a direct connection to God without priests or churches. Some rumors claim they used herbs and rituals to achieve divine union. These movements were often short-lived, violently suppressed by church and state, but they left behind tantalizing clues, traces of a medieval counterculture. The fear of these substances wasn't just about the chemicals themselves, it was about control. The medieval world was tightly ordered. Kings ruled by divine right, the church held spiritual monopoly, and peasants were expected to obey. Anything that loosened that structure, whether it was a peasant seeing visions, a woman claiming to fly, or a group meeting in the woods at night, was a threat. Drugs were the spark, but the fire was fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear that someone else might access power without permission. These fears gave rise to some of the most notorious witch hunts in history. Confessions extracted under torture often included claims of ointments, herbs, and potions. Women described flying, dancing, shape-shifting, all likely inspired by drug-induced hallucinations. These confessions, of course, were used to justify execution. And so, what may have started as private experimentation or folk healing became evidence of heresy punishable by death. In the end, medieval highs were never just about pleasure. They were about boundaries between the natural and the supernatural, the accepted and the forbidden, the sacred and the damned. Those who crossed them, willingly or not, entered dangerous territory. Some found visions, others found madness, many found the stake. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something deeply human, a desire to escape the harshness of life, to find meaning, to touch something beyond. Whether through wine in a monastery, mushrooms in a meadow, or smoke in a hut, people in the Middle Ages, just like today, sought altered states to feel more alive, more connected, more real. So next time you hear someone say people back then were simple, sober, or unimaginative, remember this. Behind the church bells and plows, behind the stone walls and strict rules, there was a world of experimentation, danger, and wonder, a world of highs and lows that shaped history in ways we're only beginning to understand. If this glimpse into the medieval mind has fascinated you, don't forget to like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the weird, wild, and wonderful past. Because history isn't just about battles and kings, it's about what people felt, feared, and secretly pursued when no one was watching.